everybody. So this is episode 7, part 5. And I know I said that I was going to speak about one of the island boys, El Indio Diego Colon, for this part. However, I did a live, and because I hadn't been able to kind of record or do anything because I was very stuck in how to get this out. Because there's a lot of people and a lot of history, and I wanted it to make sense. So we came up with the idea to actually split the historical, I don't like saying characters, the historical persons that I'm going to be considering, splitting them up by the voyages. So the island boys were from the first voyage. They were very much the protagonists of that first voyage. They were the ones that helped Colon navigate. And it makes sense then that for the second person to actually talk about Guacanagari. Because Colon met him on the first voyage. But on the first voyage, they didn't have much of an interaction. It was more of just literally what I talked about in that first part of this episode. Just basically starting a treaty contract where they said that they would help each other. It is in the second voyage that we see so many of the people that most Dominicans born and raised on the island know, like Caunabo, El Hermano de Ana Caona Vecchio. These are the people that show up in the second voyage. But in the second voyage, we also meet the Caribs. And they were actually the second group of Native Americans to directly attack Colon. But there was one Native American that really caught my eye. And she was the first documented victim of SA. I'll write it somewhere around here what that means. And I wanted to share her story first. So this is the second part of my series on the hidden legacy of the Taino and Taina warriors of 1492. An important point too with Diego Colon, El Indio Diego Colon, is that he was with Colon almost for 10 years. And so his story is very long, and I feel that he would be perfect for like capping or ending that first part of Dominican history. Because we find him in the records until about 1514. But he was with Colon through all 4 trips. So I'll probably be considering his life at the end of the first part of the series. It's around November 10th, 1493. Colon had departed Spain on September 25th, 1493. And he had already stopped in Gomera in the Canary Islands. And he was hitting really lower south of where he wanted to be. Because even though he was an expert navigator, he didn't always get it right. He had spent 6 months in Spain gathering his finances and supplies in order to get on this second trip. Because he didn't take the same route he took on the first trip, he actually ended up further south. And in these islands that he began to discover was actually populated Caribs tribe. The Caribs terrified the Tainos because they ate people. We have historical documents both from the Spanish, the English, the French. The French dealt with them more, that described the Carib practices. They had the tendency to raid Taino villages, kidnap the women, enslave the women on one island, take the men, cut off their private parts, and put the men on a separate island. So along the way, Colon finds many Tainos who have been kidnapped by the Caribs, and they beg him to please take them back, to please take them off the island. So on November 10th, Columbus's fleet, he had on this second trip 17 ships and more than 1,000 people. He had the first horses, cows, sheep, goats, and pigs and chickens that would end up in the New World. He also brought food that was not native to the Western Hemisphere, and that's where we get a lot of the foods that we eat now, like garlic and onions. So on November 10th, he was still on the island that we now call Guadalupe. He was sailing about northwest along the coast of the island of Montserrat. He had already rescued a good amount of indigenous people from these various islands, and through Diego Colon, he was able to somewhat understand that the Caribs had ravaged these islands and they supposedly had eaten all of the inhabitants. And Ferdinand Colon, or Hernando, whichever one you prefer, Colon's son, lets us know some of Colon's feelings at this time. He writes, Columbus was so anxious to relieve the men he had left on the Española that he decided to just continue sailing and not stop at any more islands. So even though Colon did not want to stop at any more islands, he was met with a storm on November 14th. So he directed the 17 ships to seek refuge or shelter in Salt River Bay, one of the islands that we now know as St. Croix, or the U.S. Virgin Islands. So once the storm had passed over, some of the men decided to go ashore. And the onboard physician named Chanca, he actually wrote about what happened. He said they went out to learn what kind of people lived there, and also because we needed information about which way to follow. Because remember, even though El Indio Diego Colon was with Colon at this time, he wasn't familiar with this part of the Caribbean. He notes that on this island, as well as in the other islands that they had stopped, most of them were women on this island, and they were prisoners of the Caribs. The men headed back, and then Colon decided to send out another group of men. And the purpose was to capture a local Indian who knew that part of the Caribbean. The group of men he sent out actually returned, not with another Indian guide, but with more women. It is said they returned with several indigenous women and 3 children. They placed them into their boat and headed towards the boats that were anchored offshore. But then they found themselves in a battle against a canoe that had 4 men and a woman. Colon's men carried these wooden shields because they had already learned about all the arrows that the indigenous people would throw at them. And that one woman in this Indian canoe proved herself to be an amazing archer. She was able to pierce their shield. The Spanish became extremely angry at this, obviously. So their idea was to ram themselves against the canoe. This managed to topple the canoe and dump the indigenous people into the water. But then something just amazing happened. The indigenous people that were in the water, the Caribs, they continued to shoot while swimming. And their arrows were not just typical arrows. These arrows were dipped in a special kind of poison. We now know that the poison was derived from beach apples, or manzanillas de la muerte, as the Spanish called them. Oviedo states that these apples were so poisonous that if a man would lie down to sleep for only an hour in the shade of one of these trees, he awoke with his head and eyes swollen and his eyebrows level with his cheeks. And the Caribs were not just satisfied with this type of poison. They actually mixed las manzanillas de la muerte with toxins or poisons from snakes and other insects. Even the leaves of this apple bush were so poisonous that the Caribs used it to poison their enemies' water supply. Peter Martyr de Angleria, remember him, the gossip that just loved everything about the indigenous people? He was very good friends with Colon, from what we understand, and he would write about everything he heard about in terms of the indigenous population in the West Indies. He actually wrote about this incident, and he said the following. He said that a woman then appeared with the other Indians, and this woman, it was seen that they respected her probably as their queen. It doesn't specifically say where she appeared at. We assume that it was on the coastline. She wasn't alone. She came with her son. And Pedro de Angleria writes, he was a fierce and robust young man with a ferocious look and the appearance of a lion. From what I understood, Colon had sent several boats to try to capture this indigenous guide that he needed. So the Caribs who had attacked hadn't just attacked a small boat. There were several Spanish boats. These were smaller boats, not the bigger one where Colon was. So the indigenous people that had been dumped in the water and continued to shoot had actually managed to hit their marks, pierced a lot of their shields, so a lot of the Spanish were wounded. And when this woman, who appeared to be their queen, and her son appeared, it seemed like they were ready to just finish whoever was left alive. It's described that one stroke after the other, they just kept on shooting. But this was tiresome, and both the indigenous people and the Spanish became exhausted in the battle. Several of the indigenous people were also wounded, and the queen's son was wounded twice. In the end, the Spanish were able to capture them. And Pedro de Angleria says, the exhausted survivors were taken prisoners, and even after being taken on board of the admiral's ship, the natives did not lose their fierceness and ferocious looks, not unlike African lions once they feel trapped. Colon finally was meeting the people that had the Taino population completely terrified. And by meeting them, he came to understand why they were so afraid. They were not only ferocious, but they also painted themselves in an extremely terrifying way. It was said that they painted themselves in a way that they looked almost cat-like. Pedro de Angleria notes that the Caribs would travel thousands of miles to capture their victims. It was the Caribs that brought this tension and this fear to the Caribbean islands. Pedro de Angleria compares the Caribs with the Tainos and says, but I feel that our natives of Española are happier than they. More so were they converted to the true religion, because naked, without burdens, limits, or death-inducing currency, money, which is our situation right now where a lot of people are drowning in debt, living in a golden age, free, without fraudulent judges, books, and content in their natural state, they live with no worries about the future. And he says about the Caribs that they are troubled by the desire to rule and waste each other away with wars. So this was the contrast from where this young girl who was captured in this battle and the Tainos that the Spanish had already met. Columbus's best friend, Michel de Cuneo, he was also of Genoa, Italy, and he accompanied Colon on the second trip. He was intrigued by the Caribs' practices. He first met the Caribs. He didn't meet the Tainos first. Cuneo was so, like I said, intrigued by the Indians that he made a lot of notes about them and their culture. He also wrote, they have flat heads and the face tattooed, of short stature. As a rule, they have a very little beard and very well-shaped legs and are thick of skin. The women have their breasts quite round and firm and well-shaped. He also described how they groomed themselves. They would shave all the hair off their bodies, if whatever hair they had left, with sharpened canes, and then the hair from their nose, they would pluck them out with their fingers. He absorbed the cranial deformation that they practiced, and they usually would do this when the person was an infant, and they would press against their forehead like a heavy plate and then wrap it around the baby's head. And as the as the skull grew, it would deform. So most of the Tainos had this kind of deformed skull. He also observed their diet, and he says that they would eat all sorts of wild and poisonous beasts, such as reptiles, and they also would eat dogs. And this we know to be absolutely true. We have found necklaces of dog teeth. He tried dog meat, and he said that it wasn't too good. He didn't like it. He also didn't like the snakes, lizards, and spiders that they ate. And he also saw how they dealt with mosquitoes. All of us who have been in DR, we all know that mosquitoes are a problem. At least when I was younger, they were a big problem. Now, I think not so much.
But he describes that they would cover their bodies with a dye to ward off the extremely annoying mosquitoes. He also said that they weren't very lustful, that they didn't engage in sexual activity a lot. But he also said that mostly, and this is his wording, according to what we have seen in all the islands where we have been, both the Indians, that is the Taino, and the Caribs are largely sodomites. Not knowing, I believe, whether they're acting right or wrong. Michel de Cuneo was also at this battle, and he recorded how the Spanish brutally dealt with the indigenous people on the canoe. He was actually present, and so he writes, one Carib was wounded by a spear in such a way that we thought he was dead. But instantly, we saw him swim. So they went to grab him, and they caught him and struggled to bring him back to the ship. But he kept fighting, even though he was wounded. What did they end up doing? He writes, we grappled with him to bring him back to the ship, where we cut off his head with an axe. They decided to take the other Caribs prisoners and eventually sent them back to Spain. But there was one indigenous girl amongst this group of people that caught Cuneo's eye. Cuneo did not bother getting her name, but he inadvertently recorded the first essay between a European and a Native American in the Western Hemisphere. And I will share with you word for word what he wrote. He writes the following. While I was on the boat, I captured a very beautiful woman, whom the Lord Admiral, who was Colon, gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her, and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling, and so treated me with her nails, that I wished I had never begun. I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth such incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually, we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought she had been brought up in a school for whores. He describes how she clawed at him to the point where he started to regret trying to violate her. And as you go through the other documents of these explorers, you can clearly tell that they saw these women just as sexual objects. They go on to describe even more explicitly their bodies, the tightness of their vaginas, and it's just, you can tell that there was absolutely no respect. Oviedo writes, the men who have had sexual intercourse with these Indian women say that they are so tight that it is with pain that a man may gratify his passion. Those who have not borne children seem to be almost virgins. And as most of us know, for the Spanish and Europe in general at this time, women's virginity was a topic of massive discussion. And that is why women were controlled to the level that they were controlled, because it was women who had the power to reproduce. Taino and Carib women were not enslaved because of just their sexuality. We know that Taino women had freedom of sexuality. They could choose to be with whoever they wanted to. Carib women were enslaved for the most part. However, it is now believed that there were two sets of Carib women. One set was the Taino women that were captured and enslaved on the islands, and the other were the actual Carib women who were basically relatives of the men who were kidnapping the Taino women. And this produced like a dual culture. The Caribs were split because they allowed the Taino women to continue their culture and to preserve their culture. And while most of the men had a completely different culture. And the topic of the indigenous women's beauty
comes up again and again. And it is said that all kinds of wars were fought because of them, because men wanted to possess them. It came to a point where the Spanish concluded that in order for them to infiltrate fully the social structure of the Tainos, they had to marry the cacique's daughters. So in the repartimiento of 1514, we see several white Spanish caciques because they had married the cacique's daughters. So it was through this interaction between this young Carib girl and the Italian Michel de Cuneo was the beginning of the rise of the Dominican nation and of all the other mixed nations in the Caribbean. The missing link, obviously, at this point are the Africans, but they're soon to arrive in the next couple of years. We don't know what happened to this Carib girl after this incident. However, it is believed that it could be possible that she was taken as a wife for one of the men, possibly for Michel de Cuneo himself. What we can say, though, is that this girl gave the Spanish a preview of what to expect. The indigenous women were not just going to simply allow them to do whatever they wanted. They fought back. Michel de Cuneo, even though he thought he was bragging about what he did to this girl, now in our time, he is seen as the disgusting man that he actually was.